Hi, I'm Camille Torres, and this is the story of how my own sister Victoria destroyed my engagement to a billionaire real estate mogul at our engagement party. Then 8 years later, at our mother's funeral, she went completely pale when she saw who I'd married. No forgiveness, no second chances, just the pure satisfaction of watching her realize that while she thought she'd won everything, I'd actually built an empire that made her stolen prize look like pocket change. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The champagne flute felt cold against my palm as I stood on the terrace of the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. The engagement party was in full swing behind me, 200 of Miami's elite celebrating what was supposed to be the beginning of my fairy tale life with David Harrison, the 34-year-old real estate development king who'd built an empire of luxury resorts and high-rise condominiums across Florida and the Caribbean. 6 months earlier, David had proposed to me on this very terrace after dating for 2 years, presenting a 10-carat emerald-cut diamond that caught the light like captured starfire. The ring had belonged to his grandmother, he'd explained, a woman who'd built the family's first hotel in Key West back in the 1950s. Tonight was meant to celebrate our upcoming December wedding, a union that would join his business dynasty with my family's respected name in Miami's art and culture scene. My father Robert had founded Torres Fine Arts 40 years ago, starting with a small gallery in Wynwood before expanding into art consulting for private collectors and corporations. While we weren't billionaires like David's family, we moved in the same circles, attended the same charity galas, summered in the same exclusive enclaves in the Hamptons. My mother Helen served on the boards of 3 major museums, and our family name carried weight in the cultural institutions that mattered to Miami's wealthy elite. I'd met David at a gallery opening featuring contemporary Latin American artists. He'd been studying a vibrant painting by a Colombian artist when I'd approached to discuss the piece. What started as professional conversation about the artwork had evolved into dinner, then weekend trips to his properties in the Keys. Then quiet mornings in his Coral Gables mansion discussing everything from architecture to philosophy. He appreciated beauty, understood the value of cultural investment, and treated me like an equal partner rather than an accessory. The engagement party guest list read like a who's who of South Florida power brokers, real estate moguls, tech entrepreneurs, shipping magnates, and old money families mingled with museum directors, gallery owners, and internationally recognized artists. The event planner had transformed the hotel's penthouse ballroom into an elegant garden party atmosphere with white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Atlantic. My sister Victoria had arrived fashionably late, as always, making an entrance in a stunning red Valentino gown that hugged her curves perfectly. At 28, 2 years younger than me, Victoria had always been the more traditionally beautiful sister. Where I had inherited our mother's angular features and artistic sensibility, Victoria possessed classic beauty with flowing blonde hair, striking blue eyes, and the kind of effortless charm that drew people to her like moths to flame. She worked as a high-end interior designer, though her trust fund from our grandmother meant she could afford to be selective about her clients. Victoria's projects typically involved designing vacation homes for wealthy families or luxury condos for David's development company. In fact, she'd been working on the interior design for his latest project, a 40-story residential tower in Brickell, for the past 6 months. I should have seen the signs. The way she'd started asking detailed questions about David's business during family dinners, how she'd begun showing up at industry events she'd never previously attended, the frequency with which she mentioned stopping by David's office to discuss design elements for the Brickell project. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But I'd been too busy planning our wedding, too caught up in the excitement of building a life with the man I loved, to pay attention to the subtle shifts in her behavior. The evening had started perfectly. David had given a toast that left half the women in the room dabbing at their eyes with cocktail napkins, speaking about finding his soulmate in someone who shared his vision for building beautiful spaces where people could create memories. My father had followed with remarks about welcoming David into our family, praising his integrity and his commitment to preserving Miami's architectural heritage through thoughtful development. I'd been mingling with guests, accepting congratulations and discussing honeymoon plans, when I'd noticed Victoria deep in conversation with David near the bar. They stood closer together than seemed necessary for casual conversation, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she leaned in to speak. Something about their body language made my stomach tighten with unease, but I dismissed the feeling as pre-wedding jitters. The first real warning came when I overheard Patricia Delacroix, a prominent socialite known for her razor-sharp observations about Miami society, speaking with her daughter near the dessert table. "Have you noticed how attentive Victoria Torres has been to David Harrison lately?" she'd murmured in her distinctive French accent. "I saw them having lunch at Joe's Stone Crab last week. Very cozy for a business meeting about interior design." My heart had begun racing as I processed her words. David hadn't mentioned having lunch with Victoria. In fact, when I'd asked about his day last Tuesday, he'd claimed to have eaten a sandwich at his desk while reviewing construction reports. The realization that he'd lied, even about something seemingly insignificant, sent alarm bells ringing in my mind. I'd excused myself from my conversation with the museum director and made my way toward David and Victoria, intending to join them casually and gauge the situation for myself. But as I approached, I caught fragments of their conversation that made my blood run cold. "This changes everything, David," Victoria was saying, her voice low but audible enough for me to hear. "You can't go through with the wedding knowing how we both feel." David's response was quieter, but I caught the words complicated, and Camille doesn't deserve this. Victoria's laugh had a bitter edge as she replied, "Camille has never understood you the way I do. She sees you as a successful businessman, but I see the artist underneath. The way you talk about creating spaces that inspire people, that's not just business to you." I'd stood frozen behind a decorative column, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain everyone in the ballroom could hear it. This couldn't be happening. Not at our engagement party, not with 200 witnesses to what was supposed to be our celebration of love and commitment. "Victoria, we can't do this here," David had said, but his tone carried resignation rather than rejection. "There are too many people who could overhear." "Then let's go somewhere private," she'd suggested, her hands sliding down to intertwine with his fingers. "The penthouse suite is empty. We need to talk about what happens next." I'd watched in horrified fascination as my fiancé and my sister walked toward the elevator together, David's hand resting on the small of Victoria's back in a gesture I'd seen him use with me countless times. The intimate familiarity of the movement suggested this wasn't their first clandestine meeting. How long had this been going on? How many lies had I been told? How many times had I thanked Victoria for helping with wedding planning while she was actively sabotaging my future? My legs had felt unsteady as I'd made my way to the ladies' room, needing privacy to process what I'd witnessed. The elegant powder room with its marble countertops and crystal fixtures felt like a sanctuary where I could try to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around me. I'd stared at my reflection in the ornate mirror, seeing a woman in a beautiful champagne-colored silk dress who looked like she was living a perfect life, while inside I felt like I was drowning. 20 minutes passed before I'd found the courage to return to the party. David and Victoria were back in the ballroom, standing on opposite sides of the room as if nothing had happened. But I could see the flush in Victoria's cheeks, the way David kept glancing in her direction when he thought no one was looking. The knowledge of their betrayal sat in my chest like a physical weight, making it difficult to breathe normally. I'd spent the remainder of the evening playing the role of happy bride-to-be, accepting congratulations and making small talk while my entire world crumbled around me. When well-meaning guests asked about wedding preparations, I'd smiled and given appropriate responses about flower arrangements and menu selections, all while wondering if there would even be a wedding to plan. The evening had finally ended near midnight, with guests departing amid promises to attend the December ceremony. David had suggested we stay the night in the penthouse suite the hotel had provided for the occasion, but I'd claimed exhaustion and asked him to take me home to my Coconut Grove apartment instead. During the drive through Miami's quiet late-night streets, I'd studied his profile in the dashboard lighting, searching for signs of guilt or deception. "Beautiful party," he'd said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. I think your parents were pleased with how everything went." The casual normalcy of his comment had felt like a slap. How could he sit there making pleasant conversation after what had happened with Victoria? How could he touch me with the same hands that had touched my sister just hours earlier? "David," I'd begun, my voice carefully controlled, "I saw you and Victoria go upstairs together tonight." His hand had tightened on the steering wheel, but his expression remained neutral. "She wanted to show me some design sketches for the Brickell project. The lighting was better in the suite than in the ballroom." The lie had been delivered so smoothly, so convincingly, that for a moment I'd almost believed him. But I'd seen the way they'd looked at each other, the intimacy in their body language. No business meeting required that kind of physical closeness. "Design sketches," I'd repeated flatly. "At our engagement party." "I know the timing wasn't ideal," he'd admitted, "but she's been struggling with some technical aspects of the penthouse layouts. As the developer, I need to address these issues before construction progresses further." We'd arrived at my apartment building before I could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal how much I actually knew. David had walked me to my door, kissed me goodnight with the same tenderness he'd always shown, and promised to call me in the morning to discuss brunch plans with my parents. Alone in my apartment, I'd finally allowed myself to fall apart. The elegant engagement dress had been carefully hung in my closet, the 10-carat ring placed on my nightstand, while I'd sat on my bathroom floor in my silk slip and cried until I had no tears left. Everything I'd believed about my life, my relationship, my future, had been revealed as an illusion. The next morning had brought a phone call that confirmed my worst fears. My best friend Sarah, who worked as a journalist for Miami Beach magazine, had called with information she'd been reluctant to share at the party. "Camille, I need to tell you something," she'd begun hesitantly. "I've been hearing rumors about David and Victoria for weeks. I didn't want to say anything without proof, but after last night—" "What kind of rumors?" I'd asked, though I'd already known the answer would destroy whatever remained of my denial. "They've been seen together at restaurants, hotels, even shopping for jewelry at Tiffany last month. My source at the hotel says they've been meeting in a suite at the Four Seasons every Tuesday afternoon for the past 2 months." The systematic nature of their deception had been breathtaking. Every Tuesday when David had claimed to be in back-to-back meetings, he'd actually been with my sister. The lunch Patricia Delacroix had mentioned was just one of many secret rendezvous. The jewelry shopping expedition suggested they were already planning their own future together. "There's more," Sarah had continued reluctantly. "Victoria apparently told someone at the party last night that David was going to break off the engagement this week. She's been showing off a sapphire bracelet that David supposedly gave her, claiming it's a promise that they'll be together soon." The bracelet detail had been the final nail in the coffin of my relationship. David had given me a similar sapphire bracelet for my birthday 6 months earlier, claiming it was custom designed exclusively for me. Learning that he'd bought identical jewelry for my sister revealed the depth of his duplicity and emotional manipulation. I'd spent that Sunday in a strange state of calm clarity, making lists and planning my next moves with the methodical precision I usually reserved for curating gallery exhibitions. The engagement had to be ended, obviously, but I needed to control the narrative and protect what remained of my dignity. More importantly, I needed to ensure that David and Victoria's betrayal became public knowledge within Miami's social circles, where reputation and integrity were currencies more valuable than money. Monday morning had arrived with unseasonable rain, the kind of gray, oppressive weather that seemed to match my emotional state. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that projected authority and composure, styling my dark hair in a sleek chignon that emphasized my cheekbones and made me look older, more serious. The engagement ring had been placed in its original Cartier box, ready to be returned. David's office occupied the top floor of a glass tower in Brickell, with panoramic views of Biscayne Bay and the Miami skyline. His assistant had seemed surprised by my unannounced visit, but had ushered me into his private office immediately. David had looked up from his computer with a warm smile that had once made my heart race but now left me completely cold. "This is a nice surprise," he'd said, rising to greet me with his usual kiss on the cheek. "I thought you were meeting with the wedding planner this morning." "I canceled that appointment," I'd replied, remaining standing near his desk rather than settling into one of the leather chairs where we'd often discussed business or made personal plans. "We need to talk about Saturday night." Something had shifted in his expression. a wariness that confirmed he knew exactly what conversation was coming. "What about Saturday night? I thought the party went perfectly." "Did it?" I'd asked, placing the Cartier box on his desk with deliberate precision. Because from where I stood, it looked like my fiancé and my sister were planning a future that didn't include me. David had stared at the ring box for a long moment before meeting my eyes. "Camille, I think you misunderstood what you saw. I misunderstood you telling Victoria that you couldn't go through with our wedding?" I'd countered. "I misunderstood her saying that I never understood you the way she does. I misunderstood you taking her to a private suite at our engagement party." The color had drained from his face as he'd realized how much I'd overheard. For the first time in the 2 years I'd known him, David Harrison had looked genuinely rattled, his usual smooth confidence replaced by the panic of a man whose carefully constructed deception was collapsing. "It's not what you think," he'd said weakly, but we'd both known the protest was futile. "Then explain it to me," I'd challenged. "Explain the Tuesday afternoon meetings at the Four Seasons. Explain the identical sapphire bracelets. Explain why my sister has been telling people you're going to break our engagement this week." Each revelation had hit him like a physical blow, his shoulders sagging as he'd realized the extent of my knowledge. The man I'd planned to marry, who'd spoken so eloquently about honesty and integrity in his toast just 2 nights earlier, had been living a double life with stunning thoroughness. "Victoria and I never meant for this to happen," he'd finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It started as a professional relationship, but we developed feelings we couldn't ignore." The clinical language he'd used to describe their affair had been almost insulting in its emotional detachment. Developed feelings. As if betraying his fiancée with her own sister was some kind of inevitable natural phenomenon, rather than a series of deliberate choices made by 2 adults who'd prioritized their desires over basic human decency. "How long?" I'd asked, needing to understand the full scope of their deception. 3 months, he'd answered after a long pause. "It started during the design consultation for the Brickell project. 3 months. A quarter of our engagement period had been built on lies." I'd calculated quickly in my mind, remembering events and conversations with new context. The weekend David had canceled our Key West trip claiming a family emergency, Victoria had coincidentally been unreachable that same weekend. The evening I'd surprised David at his office with dinner, only to find him gone when his assistant had insisted he was in meetings. The gradual cooling in his physical affection that I'd attributed to wedding stress. "And you were planning to end our engagement this week?" I'd continued, determined to extract every detail of their betrayal. "We were going to wait until after the holidays," he'd said, as if timing their revelation for maximum emotional impact was somehow considerate. "Victoria thought it would be less disruptive to your family. The idea that my sister had been strategizing about the least disruptive way to destroy my life would have been laughable if it hadn't been so devastating. Victoria had been sitting at family dinners, helping with wedding planning, and accepting my gratitude for her support, while actively plotting to steal my fiancé and calculating the optimal timing for maximum devastation. Well, you can tell Victoria that your timeline has been accelerated, I'd said, maintaining the composure that had become my armor against complete emotional collapse. Consider our engagement officially ended as of this moment. David had made half-hearted attempts to salvage the situation, claiming he'd been confused about his feelings and suggesting we could work through the problems with counseling. But we'd both known the relationship was beyond repair. Trust, once broken so completely, couldn't be rebuilt with therapy sessions and good intentions. I had left his office that morning feeling strangely liberated despite the pain. The uncertainty and doubt that had been plaguing me for weeks had been replaced by clarity and purpose. David Harrison and Victoria Torres deserved each other, and I deserved better than both of them. The next phase of my plan had involved managing the social fallout from the broken engagement. Miami's elite social circle thrived on gossip and scandal, and a broken engagement between two prominent families would provide months of entertainment for society columnists and party circuit regulars. I'd needed to ensure that the truth about David and Victoria's affair became widely known before they could spin their own narrative about our amicable separation. My mother Helen had been devastated by the news, but had rallied quickly to support damage control efforts. As someone who'd navigated Miami society for 4 decades, She'd understood immediately that controlling the story was crucial for preserving our family's reputation. Within 24 hours, she'd contacted key socialites, museum board members, and family friends with a carefully crafted version of events that portrayed me as the dignified victim of my sister's betrayal. My father Robert had been more direct in his response, immediately canceling Victoria's contract for the Brickell project interior design and making it clear that Torres Fine Arts would no longer maintain any business relationships with Harrison Development. The art world was smaller and more interconnected than most people realized, and word of Victoria's unprofessional conduct would spread quickly through the galleries, auction houses, and private collectors who comprised our professional network. Victoria herself had been surprisingly absent during this period. She'd sent a single text message apologizing for the misunderstanding and claiming she'd never intended to hurt me, but had made no effort to contact me directly or explain her actions. The cowardice of communicating through text rather than facing me in person had been the final confirmation of her true character. 2 weeks after ending my engagement, I'd made a decision that would change the trajectory of my entire life. Using the trust fund inheritance I'd received from my grandmother, plus a loan secured by my apartment equity, I'd purchased a struggling contemporary art gallery in Los Angeles. The gallery, located in the trendy arts district downtown, had enormous potential, but had been mismanaged by its previous owner. The decision to leave Miami had been both practical and emotional. Staying in the city would have meant constant encounters with David and Victoria, who had wasted no time in making their relationship public. Moving to Los Angeles offered a fresh start in a city with a thriving art scene and wealthy collectors who valued cutting-edge contemporary work. The gallery, which I'd renamed Meridian Contemporary, had become my obsession and my salvation. I'd thrown myself into renovating the space, courting artists, and building relationships with collectors and curators. The work had provided a productive outlet for my anger and heartbreak, while allowing me to build something entirely my own. Within 6 months, Meridian Contemporary had hosted its first major exhibition featuring emerging Latin American artists, drawing attention from art critics and collectors throughout California. The opening night had been attended by celebrities, tech entrepreneurs, and established gallery owners who'd been curious about the young woman who'd relocated from Miami to shake up LA's art scene. The success had been intoxicating but also isolating. Building a business from scratch required 18-hour days and complete dedication, leaving little time for personal relationships or social activities. I dated occasionally, but hadn't met anyone who could compete with my passion for the gallery and my determination to prove myself in a new city. That had changed 2 years ago when I'd met Alexander Chen at a private auction for contemporary Asian art. Alexander was a venture capitalist who specialized in funding innovative technology startups, but he also collected art with the kind of sophisticated eye that came from genuine appreciation rather than investment strategy. He'd been bidding on the same piece I'd wanted for a client, and we'd ended up in a friendly competition that had driven the price up considerably. After the auction, he'd approached me with a proposition. If I could find him 3 pieces by emerging Asian American artists within the next month, he'd pay double my usual commission and introduce me to collectors in his network. The challenge had been irresistible, and delivering on his request had led to dinner, then weekend trips to art fairs, then a relationship that had surprised us both with its depth and compatibility. Alexander understood ambition and appreciated the sacrifices required to build something meaningful. He never complained about my long hours at the gallery or my frequent travel to art fairs and studio visits. Instead, he'd become my strongest supporter, attending openings, introducing me to potential clients, and providing the kind of emotional stability I'd never experienced with David. 6 months ago, Alexander had proposed during a private tour of a Basquiat exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art. The ring was a stunning Art Deco design featuring a 2-carat diamond surrounded by sapphires, elegant and unique without being ostentatious. More importantly, the proposal had come with a partnership offer. Alexander wanted to invest in expanding Meridian Contemporary into a multi-location gallery representing some of the most exciting emerging artists in the world. Our wedding 3 months ago had been an intimate ceremony in Big Sur, attended by 50 close friends and family members. My parents had flown in from Miami, clearly impressed by Alexander's intelligence, kindness, and obvious devotion to me. The contrast between my first engagement's public spectacle and this wedding's private celebration had been intentional, reflecting how much I'd changed in the years since leaving Florida. Victoria had not been invited to the wedding, obviously. We hadn't spoken since the broken engagement, though I'd heard through mutual friends that her relationship with David had ended badly within a year. Apparently, he'd cheated on her with another interior designer, proving that people who are willing to betray one person will inevitably betray another. The poetic justice had been satisfying in a distant way, but I'd been too focused on building my new life to derive much pleasure from their misfortune. The call about my mother's illness had come 3 weeks ago. Helen had been diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer, and the doctors had given her weeks rather than months. Despite our complicated family history, I'd immediately flown to Miami to spend time with her during her final days. Sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness, I'd felt the complex emotions that come with losing a parent. Our relationship had been strained since Victoria's betrayal, with my mother struggling to maintain relationships with both daughters while clearly disapproving of Victoria's behavior. But in those final days, we'd found peace with each other and the choices we'd both made. Helen had passed away peacefully 5 days ago, surrounded by family. The funeral had been scheduled for today at the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception in Coral Gables, the same church where my parents had married 42 years earlier. I'd flown in from Los Angeles yesterday, accompanied by Alexander, who'd insisted on supporting me through this difficult time, despite having never met my family before. As I'd prepared for the funeral this morning, applying makeup carefully to conceal the evidence of grieving and selecting a black Armani dress that projected appropriate solemnity, I'd wondered whether Victoria would attend. We'd had no contact during our mother's illness, communicating through our father about practical arrangements and avoiding any direct interaction. Standing in the church now, accepting condolences from family, friends, and business associates who remembered me from the days before my exile to California, I'd felt the weight of returning to a city that held so many complicated memories. Miami looked the same, but I was fundamentally different from the woman who'd left 8 years ago with a broken heart and wounded pride. The transformation wasn't just emotional but visible. Success had given me a confidence that affected everything from my posture to my speaking voice. The gallery had made me wealthy in my own right, with annual revenues that exceeded many established galleries in New York and London. More importantly, it had given me a sense of purpose and achievement that had nothing to do with anyone else's validation or approval. Alexander's presence beside me served as a powerful symbol of how completely my life had changed. At 38, he was 2 years older than David but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd built multiple successful companies and had nothing to prove to anyone. His net worth, while not at David's level, was substantial enough to make him a serious player in both technology and art investment circles. But the most significant change was internal. The woman who'd stood in David's office 8 years ago, heartbroken and humiliated by her sister's betrayal, had been replaced by someone who knew her own worth and didn't need external validation to feel complete. Victoria could no longer hurt me because her opinion of me, her actions toward me, simply didn't matter anymore. The funeral service had been beautiful, filled with music our mother had loved and readings from poets whose work she'd championed through her museum board service. I'd delivered a eulogy that focused on Helen's contributions to Miami's cultural life, her support for emerging artists, and her dedication to making art accessible to broader communities. The words had come easily because they'd been true, and because I'd found a way to honor our relationship despite its complications. As the service concluded and mourners began filing out for the reception at our family home, I'd noticed a familiar figure in the back pew. Victoria sat alone, wearing a simple black dress that looked expensive but understated. She'd clearly seen me during the service, but had made no attempt to approach or acknowledge me. 8 years had changed her too, adding sophistication to her beauty, but also a hardness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. The reception at the Torres family home in Coral Gables provided the setting for what would become the most satisfying moment of vindication I'd ever experienced. The house, a Mediterranean revival mansion my great-grandfather had built in the 1920s, had been filled with Miami's art world elite, family friends, and business associates who'd known my mother for decades. I'd been standing near the pool terrace, discussing potential donations to the Miami Art Museum with the director, when I'd heard Alexander's voice behind me saying, "Camille, "There's someone here I think you should meet." I'd turned to find him standing with Victoria, who'd apparently approached him during my conversation with the museum director. The expression on her face, as she'd realized who Alexander was, who I'd married, had been worth every moment of pain and humiliation I'd endured 8 years earlier. Because Alexander Chen wasn't just any successful venture capitalist. He was the Alexander Chen, founder of 3 companies that had been acquired for a combined total of over $2 billion. His current investment fund managed assets worth more than David Harrison's entire real estate empire. And more than that, he was genuinely devoted to me in a way that David never had been. "Victoria," I'd said calmly, extending my hand in greeting as if we were casual acquaintances rather than sisters who'd been estranged for nearly a decade. "Thank you for coming today. Mother would have appreciated seeing you here." She'd managed to shake my hand, but I could see the shock and calculation in her eyes as she'd processed the implications of my marriage to Alexander. This wasn't just about money, though Alexander's wealth dwarfed David's. It was about the quality of the man, the obvious strength of our relationship, and the success I'd built entirely on my own terms. "Camille has told me so much about growing up here in Miami," Alexander had said with perfect diplomatic grace. "She's built something remarkable with Meridian Contemporary. I'm constantly amazed by her eye for emerging talent." The conversation had continued for several minutes, with Alexander demonstrating exactly why he'd been so successful in business and why I'd fallen in love with him. He'd been charming without being fake, interested without being intrusive, and supportive without being possessive. Every word had been a subtle demonstration of the partnership we'd built together, so different from the competitive dynamic that had characterized my relationship with David. As Victoria had finally excused herself from our conversation, claiming to see someone else she needed to speak with, I'd caught the look on her face that made 8 years of building a new life worth every moment of uncertainty and struggle. It was the expression of someone who'd finally understood that her moment of triumph had been Pyrrhic, that while she'd won a battle, I'd won the war. Because while Victoria had succeeded in destroying my engagement to David Harrison, she'd inadvertently freed me to become someone far more successful, fulfilled, and genuinely happy than I'd ever been in Miami. She'd stolen my billionaire fiancé only to discover that I'd found something infinitely more valuable, a true partnership with someone who appreciated my ambitions rather than merely tolerating them, and the satisfaction of building an empire that was entirely my own creation. The rest of the reception had passed in a blur of conversations with old friends, business discussions with potential clients, and the complex emotions that come with honoring a parent while processing a family history full of betrayal and redemption. But that moment when Victoria had realized exactly what she'd lost by destroying my first engagement, that moment had provided a sense of closure I'd never expected to feel. 8 years earlier, I'd left Miami broken and humiliated, convinced that my sister had destroyed my chance at happiness. Today, I'd returned as someone who'd built a life that exceeded my wildest dreams. Married to a man who valued my intelligence and ambition, as much as David had ever valued my social connections and physical beauty. The woman who'd cried on her bathroom floor the night of her broken engagement was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the greatest revenge isn't destruction but success, and that the best vindication comes not from bringing others down, but from rising so far above them that their opinions become irrelevant. Victoria had stolen my billionaire fiancé, but in doing so, she'd given me something far more precious: the motivation to discover who I really was and what I was truly capable of achieving. For that gift, delivered through betrayal and wrapped in pain, I was almost grateful. Almost. The weeks following my mother's funeral passed in a strange liminal space between my old life in Miami and my established life in Los Angeles. Alexander had flown back to California after 3 days to handle urgent business matters, but I had remained in Coral Gables to help my father sort through decades of accumulated possessions and memories. The process of dismantling a household that had been the center of our family's social life for 40 years proved both emotionally exhausting and unexpectedly revelatory. Helen Torres had been a meticulous record keeper, and her personal files contained detailed documentation of family financial records, social correspondence, and what amounted to a comprehensive archive of Miami's cultural elite spanning 4 decades. Among her papers, I discovered carefully preserved newspaper clippings about my broken engagement to David Harrison, Society column mentions of Victoria's brief reign as his companion, and more recently, articles about Meridian Contemporary's success in Los Angeles art circles. My mother had been quietly following my career trajectory from afar, collecting reviews of gallery exhibitions, photographs from art fair openings, and even a profile piece from Art Forum that had featured me among 30 under 30 gallery owners reshaping contemporary art. The realization that she'd been proud of my achievements, despite our strained relationship following Victoria's betrayal, provided a bittersweet sense of reconciliation with her memory. More intriguing were the financial documents that revealed the true extent of my family's wealth. Torres Fine Arts had been far more successful than I'd realized during my youth, with my father's art consulting practice generating substantial income from private collectors and corporate clients throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. The family's real estate holdings included not only our Coral Gables mansion but also properties in Key Biscayne, a penthouse apartment in Montevideo, and a coffee plantation in Colombia that had been in our family for 3 generations. My inheritance, detailed in documents my father shared with evident pride, would make me independently wealthy beyond anything I'd achieved through Meridian Contemporary's success. The trust fund established by my great-grandfather, combined with my share of the art collection and real estate portfolio, totaled an amount that rivaled the net worth of many of Miami's prominent families. Victoria's inheritance was identical in structure but would be managed through a separate trust, ensuring we'd never need to interact regarding financial matters. The revelation about our family's substantial wealth recontextualized many aspects of my childhood and young adulthood. My parents' insistence on education and professional achievement hadn't stemmed from financial necessity, but from genuine belief in the value of creating something meaningful beyond inherited money. The pressure I'd felt to establish myself in the art world had been about proving my capabilities rather than ensuring my survival. Understanding this legacy also cast Victoria's actions in a different light. Her betrayal hadn't been motivated by desperate need or genuine passion, but by competitive jealousy and entitlement. She'd destroyed my engagement not because she'd been swept away by uncontrollable feelings for David, but because she couldn't bear watching me achieve happiness and success that exceeded her own accomplishments. During my extended stay in Miami, I'd maintained careful distance from the social circles where I might encounter David or Victoria. However, the art world was smaller than many people realized, and information about former associates inevitably filtered through professional networks. Sarah, my journalist friend who'd first confirmed suspicions about the affair, provided updates about their lives with the gleeful precision of someone who specialized in tracking society scandals. David Harrison's real estate empire had suffered significant setbacks during the economic uncertainties of recent years. Several high-profile development projects had been canceled or postponed, and Harrison Development had been forced to sell assets to maintain liquidity. While he remained wealthy by most standards, his company no longer dominated Miami's luxury development market the way it had during our engagement. More personally damaging had been a series of scandals involving construction quality issues and environmental violations that had tarnished his reputation among the elite circles, where social standing mattered as much as financial success. Victoria's trajectory had been even more precipitous. Her interior design business had collapsed within 2 years of her affair with David becoming public knowledge. Wealthy clients, particularly women who'd respected my family's standing in Miami society, had quietly terminated their contracts and refused to recommend her services. The revelation that she'd betrayed her own sister to steal a client's fiancé had made her professionally toxic in a city where personal relationships and family loyalty were foundational to business success. According to Sarah's sources, Victoria had been forced to relocate to Atlanta, where she'd attempted to rebuild her career with mixed results. The design work she'd managed to secure had been primarily commercial projects, rather than the high-end residential commissions that had once defined her portfolio. Her personal life had been equally unstable, with a series of relationships that had ended badly when wealthy men discovered her history of betraying family members for personal advantage. The contrast between Victoria's declining circumstances and my own flourishing life provided a satisfaction that was both gratifying and troubling. I'd never wished genuine hardship on my sister, despite her devastating betrayal, but witnessing the natural consequences of her choices offered validation that integrity and loyalty ultimately mattered more than short-term opportunism. My father Robert had aged considerably during my mother's illness, but her death seemed to have liberated him from caretaking responsibilities that had constrained his activities for months. During our weeks together sorting through family possessions, we developed a deeper relationship than had existed during my youth. Without my mother's dominant personality shaping family dynamics, my father revealed himself to be more perceptive and emotionally intelligent than I'd previously understood. One evening, as we'd sat on the terrace overlooking the garden where my mother had hosted countless fundraising events for Miami's cultural institutions, my father had broached the subject of Victoria directly for the first time since the funeral. "Your sister made choices that cost her everything meaningful in her life," he'd said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of disappointment and regret. "She traded family loyalty for a man who was never worthy of either of you, and she's been paying the price ever since." I'd remained silent, uncertain how to respond to his assessment of Victoria's situation. During the years of our estrangement, I'd avoided discussing her with family members, preferring to focus on building my new life rather than dwelling on past betrayals. "I know you've built a wonderful life in Los Angeles," he'd continued, "but I hope you'll consider maintaining some connection to Miami. This house, your mother's work with the museums, the family business, they're all part of a legacy that shouldn't end with her death." The suggestion had surprised me. During my youth, my father had seemed to view my artistic interests as impractical hobbies rather than serious career pursuits. The idea that he now saw me as capable of continuing the family's cultural leadership represented a significant shift in his perception of my capabilities. "What about Victoria?" I'd asked, curious about his thoughts on family reconciliation. "She's still your daughter." My father had been quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden, where my mother's prized orchids continued blooming despite her absence. "Victoria will always be my daughter, and I'll always love her. But love doesn't require trust or respect. She chose her path, and the consequences have been severe. I won't enable her poor decisions by pretending they didn't matter." His stark assessment had been both shocking and liberating. For years, I'd wondered whether my refusal to forgive Victoria's betrayal made me vindictive or cruel. Hearing my father acknowledge that some actions had consequences that couldn't be overcome through familial obligation provided permission to maintain boundaries I'd established for my own emotional protection. The conversation had evolved into discussions about my potential role in maintaining family traditions and supporting Miami's cultural institutions. My father had proposed that I consider establishing a satellite location for Meridian Contemporary in Miami, leveraging both the family's local connections and the city's growing appreciation for contemporary Latin American art. The idea had merit from both business and personal perspectives, offering opportunities to expand my gallery's influence while honoring my mother's legacy of cultural leadership. 3 weeks into my extended Miami stay, I'd received an unexpected phone call that would force me to confront Victoria directly for the first time since our mother's funeral. The caller was Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, director of the Miami Art Museum, who'd known our family for decades through my mother's board service and fundraising activities. "Camille, I hope you don't mind me reaching out during this difficult time," Dr. Morrison had begun, her voice carrying the diplomatic tone that museum directors perfected through years of soliciting donations from temperamental benefactors. "I wanted to discuss a situation that requires delicate handling, and I believe you're the best person to address it." The situation, as Dr. Morrison explained it, involved Victoria's attempt to claim authority over our mother's planned bequest to the museum. Helen Torres had committed to donating a significant portion of her personal art collection to establish a permanent contemporary Latin American wing, but the legal documentation hadn't been finalized before her death. Victoria was now claiming that, as the daughter who'd remained in Miami, she should have decision-making authority over the donation's terms and implementation. "Your mother specifically mentioned wanting you involved in overseeing the donation," Dr. Morrison had continued. "She felt your expertise in contemporary art made you the natural choice to curate the collection and ensure it reflected her vision for supporting emerging artists." The situation represented exactly the kind of manipulation I'd expected from Victoria. She'd had minimal contact with our mother during her final years, rarely visiting during her illness, and contributing nothing to her care or comfort. Now, faced with the opportunity to claim credit for a significant cultural contribution, she was asserting family authority she'd abdicated through her own choices. More troubling was the implication that Victoria was attempting to use our mother's legacy as a pathway back into Miami's elite social circles. Association with a major museum donation would provide the kind of cultural credibility that could rehabilitate her damaged reputation and potentially revive her struggling career. I'd agreed to meet with Dr. Morrison and the museum's board to discuss the situation, knowing that the conversation would inevitably require direct confrontation with Victoria. The meeting had been scheduled for the following week at the museum's administrative offices, providing time for me to prepare both legally and emotionally for what promised to be a challenging encounter. My preparation had involved consulting with the estate attorney who'd handled my mother's legal affairs, reviewing documentation of her stated intentions regarding the art collection, and developing a strategy for protecting her wishes while avoiding unnecessary family conflict. The attorney had assured me that my mother's verbal instructions, combined with written correspondence with Dr. Morrison, established clear evidence of her intentions regarding my involvement in overseeing the donation. More importantly, I'd spent time reflecting on my motivations for engaging in this conflict. Was I fighting to honor my mother's wishes, or was I seeking another opportunity to demonstrate my superiority over Victoria? The distinction mattered, both for my own integrity and for the effectiveness of my approach to resolving the situation. The meeting at the Miami Art Museum had taken place on a humid Thursday afternoon, in a conference room overlooking Biscayne Bay, where my mother had attended countless board meetings during her decades of service. Dr. Morrison had been present along with 3 board members, the museum's chief curator, and a representative from the development office. Victoria had arrived precisely on time, dressed in a conservative navy suit that projected professional competence while maintaining appropriate solemnity for discussions involving our recently deceased mother. 8 years had changed Victoria in ways that extended beyond the physical aging process. The confident, radiant woman who'd stolen my fiancé had been replaced by someone whose beauty remained intact, but whose demeanor carried an edge of desperation that hadn't been present during our youth. She'd greeted me with formal politeness, acknowledging my presence without warmth or genuine emotion. "Thank you all for accommodating this meeting during a difficult time for the Torres family," Dr. Morrison had begun, her diplomatic skills evident in the careful neutrality of her tone. "We're here to discuss Helen Torres's intended bequest to the museum and ensure that her wishes are implemented in a manner that honors both her memory and her commitment to supporting contemporary Latin American artists." Victoria had immediately launched into a prepared statement about her qualifications to oversee the donation, emphasizing her interior design background, her years of residence in Miami, and her familiarity with our mother's collecting preferences. Her presentation had been polished and persuasive, demonstrating the verbal skills that had made her successful in client relationships during the peak of her career. "As the daughter who remained close to our mother throughout her life," Victoria had concluded, "I believe I'm best positioned to understand her vision and ensure the donation reflects her true intentions." The statement's implications had been both obvious and infuriating. Victoria was suggesting that my years in Los Angeles had disconnected me from family relationships, and that my mother's wishes were somehow unknowable to her other daughter. The manipulation was classic Victoria, using emotional appeals and implied criticism to advance her position while appearing to take the moral high ground. My response had been carefully measured, focusing on factual information rather than personal conflict. My mother and I discussed her plans for this donation extensively during her final weeks. She specifically mentioned wanting the collection to support emerging artists rather than established names, and she felt strongly that the curatorial decisions should be made by someone with professional expertise in contemporary art markets. I then outlined my qualifications in detail. My experience building Meridian Contemporary from a struggling gallery into a nationally recognized institution, my relationships with collectors and artists throughout Latin America, and my track record of identifying and supporting emerging talent that had subsequently gained international. The presentation had been professional rather than personal, emphasizing competence over family dynamics. Dr. Morrison had then shared correspondence from my mother that explicitly mentioned her desire for me to be involved in implementing the donation. The letters, written during the months before her death, clearly stated her belief that my expertise would ensure the collection had maximum impact in supporting emerging artists and enhancing Miami's reputation as a center for contemporary Latin American art. The documentary evidence had been damaging to Victoria's position, but she'd responded with characteristic adaptability. "Of course Camille has impressive professional credentials," she'd acknowledged gracefully. "I'm not suggesting she shouldn't be involved. I'm simply proposing that decisions about our mother's legacy should involve both daughters working together to honor her memory." The suggestion of collaboration had been strategically brilliant, positioning Victoria as the reasonable party seeking family unity, while making me appear petty if I refused to work with her. However, the proposal had also been completely impractical given our history and the fundamental differences in our approaches to both business and family relationships. "I appreciate the sentiment," I'd replied carefully, "but effective curation requires clear decision-making authority and consistent vision. Collaborative approaches work well for some projects, but this donation is too important to risk delays or conflicts that could compromise the outcome." The conversation had continued for nearly 2 hours, with board members asking detailed questions about implementation timelines, curatorial strategies, and administrative responsibilities. Throughout the discussion, Victoria had demonstrated impressive knowledge about museum operations and donor relations, suggesting she'd prepared extensively for the meeting. However, her understanding of contemporary art markets and emerging artist development had been superficial, revealing the limitations of her design background when applied to serious curatorial work. The meeting had concluded without definitive resolution, with Dr. Morrison promising to review all documentation and consult with the museum's legal counsel before making recommendations to the full board. However, the dynamic had been clear. My professional qualifications and documented evidence of our mother's intentions provided a stronger foundation for claiming authority over the donation than Victoria's emotional appeals and local residents. Walking out of the museum that afternoon, I'd felt both satisfaction and exhaustion from the encounter. Victoria's attempt to claim control over our mother's legacy had been predictable, but successfully defending against her manipulation required emotional energy I'd prefer to direct toward more constructive purposes. The incident had also reminded me why I'd chosen to build my life thousands of miles away from the family dynamics that had shaped my youth. That evening, my father and I had discussed the museum meeting over dinner at his favorite restaurant in Coconut Grove. His response to Victoria's behavior had been disappointment rather than surprise, confirming that her pattern of self-serving manipulation had been evident to family members long before her betrayal of my engagement. "Your sister has always believed that wanting something badly enough should be sufficient to obtain it," he'd observed sadly. "She's never understood that achievement requires sustained effort and genuine expertise, not just ambition and presentation skills." His assessment had been harsh, but accurate. Victoria's approach to life had always involved identifying what she wanted and finding the most direct path to obtaining it, regardless of the consequences for other people or the sustainability of her methods. The strategy had worked during her youth, when her beauty and charm had been sufficient to open doors, but it had proven inadequate for building lasting success or meaningful relationships. The museum board's decision had been communicated the following week through a formal letter from Dr. Morrison. After reviewing all documentation and consulting with legal counsel, they'd determined that my mother's intentions were clear and that I should have primary authority over implementing the donation. Victoria would be acknowledged as a contributing family member and invited to participate in ceremonial events, but curatorial decisions would be my responsibility. The victory had been complete, but not entirely satisfying. While I'd succeeded in protecting my mother's wishes and ensuring the donation would be implemented effectively, the conflict had required engaging with Victoria in ways that reminded me of all the reasons I'd chosen to maintain distance from my family. Every interaction with my sister involved manipulation, hidden agendas, and emotional exhaustion that detracted from more meaningful pursuits. More importantly, the museum situation had clarified my thinking about my future relationship with Miami and my family's legacy. While I valued the opportunity to honor my mother's memory and support contemporary Latin American artists, I had no desire to become entangled in ongoing conflicts with Victoria over family resources or social standing. My life in Los Angeles, my marriage to Alexander, and my success with Meridian Contemporary represented authentic achievements that didn't require family validation or local recognition. The realization had been liberating in unexpected ways. For years, I'd wondered whether my estrangement from Victoria represented failure to forgive or inability to move beyond past hurts. The museum conflict had demonstrated that maintaining boundaries wasn't about harboring resentment, but about protecting my energy and focus for relationships and pursuits that enriched my life rather than draining it. As my extended stay in Miami drew to a close, I'd made several important decisions about my future relationship with the city and my family obligations. I would oversee the implementation of my mother's museum donation, ensuring it reflected her vision and supported emerging artists effectively. I would maintain the family's Coral Gables house as a base for periodic visits and potential business expansion. And I would continue supporting my father while respecting his independence and his complex relationship with Victoria. However, I would not attempt to rebuild a relationship with my sister or pretend that family loyalty required tolerating her manipulative behavior. The museum conflict had reminded me that Victoria's fundamental character hadn't changed, despite the consequences she'd faced for her past actions. She remained someone who prioritized personal advantage over family relationships, and who would sacrifice other people's well-being to achieve her goals. The night before my return to Los Angeles, I'd sat on the terrace of my family home for what might be the last time, watching the sun set over Coral Gables, and reflecting on the changes 8 years had brought to my life and relationships. The woman who'd fled Miami with a broken heart and shattered confidence had returned as someone who could navigate family conflicts with professional competence and emotional detachment. More significantly, I discovered that vindication didn't require Victoria's acknowledgement or approval. The moment at my mother's funeral when she'd realized who I'd married had provided satisfying confirmation of my success, but it hadn't fundamentally changed my sense of self-worth or accomplishment. My value didn't depend on her recognition any more than it had depended on David's approval 8 years earlier. The next morning, Alexander had called to discuss my return flight arrangements and update me on gallery business that had accumulated during my absence. His voice had carried the warmth and concern that characterized our relationship, reminding me of the life I'd built with someone who valued my intelligence, ambition, and integrity without reservation or competition. "How are you feeling about leaving Miami?" he'd asked, understanding that my extended stay had involved processing complex emotions about family, loss, and identity. "Ready," I'd replied honestly. "I've done what I needed to do here. Now I want to come home." The word home had carried new meaning after weeks of confronting my past and reaffirming my present choices. Home wasn't the city where I'd been born or the house where I'd grown up. Home was the life I'd created with Alexander, the gallery I'd built through my own vision and effort, and the future we were planning together based on mutual respect and shared values. Flying back to Los Angeles that evening, watching Miami's lights disappear beneath the clouds, I'd felt a profound sense of completion. The chapter of my life that had begun with Victoria's betrayal was finally closed, not through reconciliation or revenge, but through the quiet confidence that came from building something meaningful and lasting on my own terms. 8 years earlier, I'd left Miami believing that my sister had destroyed my chance at happiness. Now I understood that she'd actually freed me to discover what happiness could look like when it wasn't dependent on anyone else's choices or approval. For that unexpected gift, delivered through betrayal and wrapped in pain, I was genuinely grateful. The woman who returned to Los Angeles was someone who had fully claimed her own power, her own worth, and her own definition of success. Victoria could no longer hurt me, because her opinion of me, her actions toward me, simply didn't matter anymore. I had transcended the need for her acknowledgement, just as I had transcended the need for David's validation years earlier. What mattered now was the life I continued building each day, the artists I supported through my gallery, the love I shared with Alexander, and the legacy I would create through my own choices and achievements. That legacy would stand independent of family approval or social recognition, grounded in integrity and sustained by purpose that came from within rather than from external validation. The plane touched down at LAX as the California sun was setting, painting the sky in the same shades of gold and crimson I'd watched from the Fontainebleau terrace 8 years earlier. But everything else had changed, transformed by choices I'd made and a strength I'd discovered in the wreckage of my first heartbreak. Tomorrow I would return to Meridian Contemporary, to the artists and collectors who comprised my professional world, to the life I'd built that belonged entirely to me. Tonight I would sleep beside the man who loved me for exactly who I was, in the home we'd created together, surrounded by art that reflected my vision and taste. Victoria had stolen my billionaire fiancé, But in doing so, she'd forced me to discover that I was capable of creating something far more valuable than anything she could take away. The greatest revenge, I'd learned, wasn't bringing others down but rising so far above them that their actions became irrelevant to your happiness. And I had risen higher than I'd ever imagined possible. Returning to Los Angeles felt like stepping back into my authentic life after months of navigating the emotional minefield of family obligations and unresolved history. Meridian Contemporary welcomed me back with the familiar energy of a thriving business, and the gallery's white walls lined with carefully curated contemporary pieces reminded me of everything I'd built independent of family expectations or childhood dynamics. Alexander had arranged for fresh flowers throughout our Brentwood home, and dinner from my favorite restaurant awaited my arrival. The thoughtfulness of these gestures, combined with his genuine interest in how I'd processed my time in Miami, reinforced why our relationship worked so fundamentally well. He understood that grief and family conflict were complex experiences that required space and support, rather than solutions or advice. "How do you feel about the museum situation?" he asked as we sat on our terrace overlooking the canyon, sharing wine and catching up on the weeks we'd spent apart. "Vindicated, but also tired," I replied honestly. "Victoria hasn't changed. She's still the same person who prioritizes personal advantage over family loyalty. Engaging with her manipulation was necessary to protect my mother's wishes, but it reminded me why I chose to build my life 3,000 miles away." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "And now that it's resolved, now I can focus on what matters to me rather than what she's trying to take away," I said, feeling the truth of those words settle into my bones. "The donation will be implemented properly, emerging artists will benefit from my mother's collection, and I can return to building something meaningful here." The next few months proved transformative for both Meridian Contemporary and my personal sense of purpose. The inheritance from my mother's estate provided capital for expansion I'd been planning for years, and I decided to open a second location in New York's Chelsea district, positioning the gallery to compete with the most prestigious contemporary art spaces in the world. The New York expansion required months of preparation, location scouting, and relationship building with East Coast collectors and curators. I'd spent weeks in Manhattan, meeting with potential clients, visiting artists' studios, and establishing connections with the network of gallery owners, critics, and collectors who shaped contemporary art markets. The work was exhausting but exhilarating, representing the culmination of everything I'd learned about building cultural institutions that supported emerging talent while maintaining commercial viability. During this period of intense professional focus, I'd received periodic updates about Victoria through the Miami social network that persisted despite geographical distance. Sarah continued providing information with the enthusiasm of someone who'd followed our family drama for years, and my father occasionally mentioned Victoria during our weekly phone conversations, though he maintained careful neutrality about her circumstances. The reports painted a picture of continued struggle and declining prospects. Victoria's Atlanta design business had failed completely, leaving her with significant debt and damaged professional reputation. She'd returned to Miami hoping to rebuild her career, but the market had moved beyond her capabilities during her absence, and few clients were willing to risk association with someone whose personal conduct had become legendary among the social circles where interior designers found their most profitable commissions. More troubling were rumors about Victoria's personal life, which suggested a pattern of increasingly desperate attempts to secure financial stability through relationships with wealthy men. Several sources reported seeing her at charity events and private parties, always immaculately dressed but clearly hunting for opportunities, rather than attending for genuine interest in the causes or social connections. The information about Victoria's circumstances should have provided satisfaction, but instead, it generated a complex mixture of pity and relief. I felt sorry for the woman who'd destroyed her own life through short-sighted choices, but I also felt grateful that my decision to maintain distance had protected me from being drawn into her continuing drama. My professional success during this period provided a stark contrast to Victoria's declining fortunes. The New York location of Meridian Contemporary opened to significant critical acclaim, with reviews in Artforum, Art in America, and the New York Times praising both the gallery's curatorial vision and its commitment to supporting emerging artists from Latin America and the Caribbean. The opening exhibition, featuring works by 12 artists I'd discovered during studio visits throughout Mexico and Colombia, sold out within the first week. More significantly, the gallery's success was attracting attention from major collectors and institutions beyond the traditional contemporary art world. Tech entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley, entertainment industry executives from Los Angeles, and financial sector leaders from New York were acquiring pieces for both personal collections and corporate installations. The breadth of our client base provided financial stability that allowed me to take risks on experimental work and unknown artists. Alexander had been instrumental in connecting me with collectors from his venture capital network, but he'd been careful to let me develop these relationships independently, rather than positioning himself as an intermediary. His understanding of how to support my career without overshadowing my achievements represented exactly the kind of partnership I'd never experienced with David, whose approach to business relationships had always emphasized his own importance and influence. The contrast between my current life and the trajectory I'd been on 8 years earlier became particularly apparent during a gallery opening in New York that coincided with a major contemporary art fair. The event drew collectors, curators, and artists from around the world, and I found myself moving through conversations with museum directors, discussing acquisition possibilities with private collectors, and fielding interview requests from art publications. Standing in the gallery surrounded by works I'd selected and artists I'd supported, wearing a custom dress that reflected my personal style rather than someone else's expectations, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from building something authentic and meaningful. This success belonged entirely to me, earned through years of careful curation, relationship building, and risk-taking that had nothing to do with family connections or romantic partnerships. The evening's highlight came when Isabella Rodriguez, director of the Whitney Museum, approached me about organizing a major exhibition featuring contemporary Latin American artists for the following year. The opportunity represented exactly the kind of institutional recognition that established gallery owners as serious players in the art world, and it had emerged from the quality of my curatorial work, rather than from social connections or inherited advantages. "Your eye for emerging talent is remarkable," Isabella had said as we discussed potential artists and themes for the exhibition. "The way you've developed careers for artists who were completely unknown just 3 years ago suggests a genuine understanding of where contemporary art is heading." The conversation had continued for nearly an hour, with Isabella expressing interest in several artists whose work I'd been following since their graduate school exhibitions. The possibility of presenting their work in one of America's most prestigious museums represented the kind of career-making opportunity that artists dreamed about, and that gallery owners worked years to facilitate. Flying back to Los Angeles after the opening, I'd reflected on how completely my life had transformed since leaving Miami 8 years earlier. The woman who'd fled Florida with a broken heart and wounded pride had evolved into someone who commanded respect in international art circles, who discovered and developed emerging talent, and who had built institutions that would influence contemporary culture for decades. More importantly, this success had been achieved entirely through my own vision and effort, without depending on family legacy, romantic partnerships, or inherited advantages. While my mother's inheritance had provided capital for expansion, the fundamental success of Meridian Contemporary reflected years of learning about artists, collectors, and markets that had nothing to do with my background or connections. The realization generated a profound sense of personal fulfillment that was qualitatively different from any satisfaction I derived from external recognition or family approval. This was success that belonged to me completely, that couldn't be taken away by anyone else's choices or actions, and that would continue growing regardless of what happened in my personal relationships or family dynamics. During this period of professional triumph, I'd also begun planning a project that would represent the culmination of my work, supporting emerging artists. Using a portion of my inheritance, I was establishing a foundation that would provide grants, studio space, and exhibition opportunities for artists from Latin America and the Caribbean who were developing careers in the United States. The foundation would operate independently of Meridian Contemporary, though the gallery would frequently feature work by foundation-supported artists. The structure would allow me to support experimental and uncommercial work that might not be viable in a purely commercial gallery setting, while also providing emerging artists with the kind of institutional support that could accelerate their career development. Alexander had been enthusiastic about the foundation concept, offering both financial support and strategic advice about structuring nonprofit organizations effectively. His experience with startups and emerging technologies provided valuable perspective on how to identify and develop talent in competitive creative fields. "You're essentially doing for artists what venture capitalists do for entrepreneurs," he'd observed during one of our planning sessions. "Identifying potential before it's obvious to everyone else, and providing the resources necessary to realize that potential." The parallel between art curation and venture capital investing hadn't occurred to me before, but it explained why Alexander understood my work so intuitively. Both fields required the ability to recognize talent and vision before they'd been validated by market success, and both involved taking calculated risks on people and ideas that might fail spectacularly or succeed beyond expectations. Planning the foundation had also provided an opportunity to clarify my long-term vision for cultural impact beyond commercial success. While Meridian Contemporary needed to remain profitable to survive, the foundation would allow me to support work that challenged conventional aesthetics, addressed social issues, or explored experimental techniques that might not appeal to traditional collectors. The project represented everything I'd learned about building sustainable institutions that could outlast individual personalities or market conditions. Unlike Victoria's approach to life, which had always focused on short-term advantages and immediate gratification, my foundation planning required thinking decades ahead about how to create lasting value for artists and communities. As the foundation's structure took shape, I'd found myself thinking about legacy in ways that went beyond personal achievement or family recognition. The artists I supported through grants and exhibitions would hopefully create work that influenced contemporary culture for generations. Their success would generate ripple effects that extended far beyond my direct involvement, creating value that multiplied rather than diminished over time. This understanding of genuine legacy stood in sharp contrast to Victoria's continued focus on appearance and immediate advantage. While she struggled to rebuild a fidokai career based on cultivating wealthy clients and maintaining social connections, I was building institutions that would continue supporting artists long after I was no longer personally involved in their management. The difference reflected fundamentally different approaches to life and success. Victoria had always sought to extract value from existing systems and relationships, positioning herself to benefit from other people's achievements and resources. My approach involved creating new value through institutions and opportunities that hadn't existed before, contributing to cultural conversations rather than simply participating in them. By the end of my first year back from Miami, both Meridian Contemporary locations were thriving. The foundation was operational and supporting its first cohort of artists, and Alexander and I were discussing plans for expanding our family through adoption. Our life together had achieved a stability and purposefulness that I'd never imagined during my 20s, when success had seemed dependent on external validation and social recognition. The woman who'd once measured her worth by her engagement to a wealthy real estate developer had evolved into someone whose sense of purpose came from supporting emerging artists, building cultural institutions, and creating opportunities for people whose work challenged and expanded contemporary aesthetic understanding. This transformation hadn't happened despite Victoria's betrayal, but because of it, through the necessity of discovering who I was beyond family dynamics and romantic relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me that Victoria's moment of triumph 8 years earlier had actually freed me to become someone far more accomplished and fulfilled than I could have been as David Harrison's wife. By forcing me to rebuild my life from nothing, she'd inadvertently given me the opportunity to discover capabilities and ambitions I'd never explored, while living within the comfortable constraints of family expectations and social convention. That realization provided the final piece of emotional closure I'd been seeking since our confrontation at the museum. Victoria's betrayal had been devastating at the time, but it had ultimately led to achievements and relationships that exceeded anything I'd thought possible during my youth. For that unexpected gift, delivered through cruelty and wrapped in pain, I was genuinely grateful rather than merely vindicated. The woman who'd cried on her bathroom floor the night of her broken engagement was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the greatest success comes not from defeating others, but from building something meaningful that enriches the world beyond your own immediate interests. Victoria could no longer hurt me because her opinion simply didn't matter compared to the artists whose careers I was developing, the collectors who trusted my curatorial vision, and the husband who supported my ambitions without reservation or competition. I had transcended the need for family approval just as I had transcended the need for social validation, finding purpose and satisfaction in work that would continue making a difference long after the personal dramas of my youth were forgotten. That was the kind of success that couldn't be stolen, manipulated, or diminished by anyone else's choices or actions. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, interrupting my review of applications for the Foundation's second annual grant cycle. My father's voice carried an urgency I hadn't heard since my mother's diagnosis, immediately capturing my attention despite the early hour in Los Angeles. "Camille, I need to tell you something about Victoria before you hear it from someone else," he began without his usual pleasantries. "She's been arrested." The news hit me with unexpected force. Despite years of hearing about Victoria's declining circumstances and increasingly desperate choices. "Arrested for what?" "Fraud," my father replied heavily. "She's been running some kind of investment scheme targeting wealthy widows in Coral Gables. The police estimate she's taken nearly $2 million over the past 18 months. I sank into my office chair, struggling to process the magnitude of Victoria's downfall. While I'd known she was struggling financially and had heard rumors about her cultivating relationships with older, wealthy men, I hadn't imagined she'd crossed the line into criminal behavior. "How did this happen?" I asked, though part of me already understood the progression from manipulation to outright theft. My father's explanation revealed a scheme that was both sophisticated and pathetically transparent. Victoria had been targeting recently widowed women in Miami's wealthiest neighborhoods, approaching them at charity events and social gatherings, with offers to help redesign their homes as a way to process their grief and start fresh. She'd convinced these vulnerable women to advance large sums for furniture, art, and renovation materials that were never purchased or delivered. The scheme had worked initially because Victoria's family name and social connections provided credibility, and because her targets were emotionally vulnerable and socially isolated. She'd exploited their grief and loneliness to extract money for fictional projects, always promising that delays were temporary and that spectacular results were imminent. "Mrs. Patterson was the one who finally contacted the police," my father continued, his voice heavy with shame. "She'd given Victoria $300,000 for a complete home renovation that never began. When she started asking questions, Victoria told her the contractors had run off with the money, and she was pursuing legal action to recover it." The cruelty of targeting grieving widows represented a new low even for Victoria, demonstrating how completely her moral compass had been corrupted by desperation and entitlement. These women had lost their husbands and were seeking connection and purpose, only to be victimized by someone who understood exactly how to exploit their vulnerability. "Is she in jail?" I asked, wondering about the immediate consequences Victoria was facing. "She posted bail yesterday, but the evidence is overwhelming," my father replied. "Bank records, text messages, witnesses who can testify about her promises, and the lack of any actual work. Her attorney thinks she'll probably take a plea deal to avoid a trial." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my father sharing details about the investigation and his own shock at discovering the extent of Victoria's criminal behavior. He'd known she was struggling financially, but he'd assumed she was simply having difficulty rebuilding her career rather than actively defrauding vulnerable elderly women. "I keep asking myself where I went wrong as a parent," he said toward the end of our conversation, his voice breaking slightly. "How did I raise two daughters who turned out so differently?" "You didn't go wrong," I assured him, meaning it completely. "Victoria made her own choices, just like I made mine. You taught us both the same values about integrity and treating people with respect. She chose to ignore those lessons when they became inconvenient." After ending the call, I sat in my office staring out at the Los Angeles skyline, trying to reconcile the woman who'd stolen my fiancé with someone capable of defrauding grieving widows. While Victoria had always been manipulative and self-serving, her previous behavior had involved taking advantage of opportunities rather than creating elaborate schemes to victimize vulnerable people. The progression from romantic betrayal to criminal fraud made sense in retrospect. Victoria had never developed the skills necessary for legitimate success, relying instead on her beauty, charm, and family connections to achieve her goals. When those advantages proved insufficient to maintain the lifestyle she felt entitled to, she'd escalated to increasingly desperate and unethical methods. Alexander found me still processing the news when he returned from his morning run, immediately recognizing that something significant had happened. I shared the details of Victoria's arrest and the charges she was facing, watching his expression shift from surprise to disgust as he understood the nature of her crimes. "Targeting widows is particularly cruel," he observed, echoing my own reaction. "These women are already dealing with loss and vulnerability. Taking advantage of their grief shows a complete absence of empathy. The worst part is that she used our family's reputation to gain their trust," I replied. "The Torres name still carries weight in Miami's social circles. These women probably felt safe working with her because they knew our parents and respected our family's standing in the community." The conversation evolved into broader discussions about family loyalty, personal responsibility, and the point at which someone's actions become so harmful that continued association becomes complicity. Alexander had dealt with similar issues in his business life, encountering entrepreneurs whose unethical behavior eventually forced him to cut ties despite personal relationships or financial investments. "You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved," he said gently. "And you can't be responsible for choices other people make, even if they're family members." His perspective helped clarify my own feelings about Victoria's situation. While I felt sorry for the elderly women she'd victimized and embarrassed by the damage to our family's reputation, I didn't feel personally responsible for her actions or obligated to support her through the consequences she was facing. The news about Victoria's arrest spread quickly through Miami's social networks, generating the kind of scandal that would be discussed at dinner parties and charity events for months. Sarah called within hours of my conversation with my father, having already heard multiple versions of the story from various sources in the journalism and social communities. "The consensus seems to be that people are shocked but not entirely surprised," Sarah reported with the analytical tone she brought to covering society scandals. "Everyone knew Victoria was struggling, and there were rumors about her targeting older men for money. I guess the progression to outright fraud was just the next logical step. The lack of surprise from people who'd known Victoria throughout her life confirmed my own assessment of her character development. The signs of moral deterioration had been visible for years to anyone paying attention, from her betrayal of my engagement to her subsequent pattern of unstable relationships and financial difficulties. More troubling was learning about the broader impact of Victoria's crimes on our family's reputation within Miami's cultural and social communities. Several people had already asked my father whether the family would compensate Victoria's victims, and there was speculation about whether the scandal would affect my involvement with the Miami Art Museum donation. Dr. Morrison called later that week to discuss the museum situation directly, her diplomatic skills evident in how she approached the sensitive topic of family scandal affecting institutional relationships. "The board is concerned about potential negative publicity associated with the Torres family name," she admitted during our phone conversation. "Some members are worried that ongoing coverage of Victoria's legal troubles could overshadow the positive impact of your mother's donation. The suggestion that Victoria's criminal behavior might affect my mother's cultural legacy was infuriating, but I understood the museum's position. Cultural institutions depended on maintaining positive relationships with donors and avoiding controversies that might discourage future philanthropy. What would you recommend?" I asked, prepared to protect my mother's wishes regardless of the complications Victoria had created. "Perhaps we could expedite the implementation process," Dr. Morrison suggested. "If we can announce the donation and begin the exhibition planning quickly, it might help establish the positive narrative before the legal proceedings generate more negative coverage." I agreed to accelerate the timeline for implementing my mother's donation, recognizing that swift action would protect her legacy while demonstrating that Victoria's choices had no impact on legitimate family contributions to Miami's cultural life. The decision required intensive coordination between Los Angeles and Miami, but it would ensure that my mother's collection received appropriate recognition regardless of ongoing family drama. Working on the museum project also provided productive distraction from the emotional complexity of watching Victoria face criminal prosecution. While I had no intention of supporting her or minimizing the seriousness of her crimes, witnessing the complete destruction of someone I'd once cared about generated feelings I struggled to process. The woman who'd been my sister, despite everything that had happened between us, was now facing potential imprisonment for victimizing elderly women who'd trusted her because of our family's reputation. The progression from sibling rivalry to criminal behavior represented a cautionary tale about what happened when someone's sense of entitlement overwhelmed their moral compass. Alexander helped me work through these complicated emotions during long conversations about family relationships, personal responsibility, and the difference between forgiveness and enablement. His perspective, shaped by experience with entrepreneurs who'd made poor decisions under pressure, provided valuable context for understanding Victoria's choices without excusing their impact on innocent victims. Some people respond to setbacks by working harder and making better choices, he observed during one of these discussions. Others respond by lowering their standards and blaming external circumstances for their problems. Victoria clearly chose the second path. The distinction helped clarify why my own response to heartbreak and professional challenges had led to growth and achievement, while Victoria's similar experiences had resulted in increasingly destructive behavior. We'd faced comparable obstacles but had made fundamentally different choices about how to respond to adversity. 3 weeks after Victoria's arrest, my father called with an update about her legal situation. Her attorney had negotiated a plea agreement that would require full restitution to her victims, 5 years of probation, and community service, but would allow her to avoid prison time if she maintained employment and stayed out of further legal trouble. She'll have to pay back every penny, my father explained, but most of the money is gone. She spent it on rent, car payments, and maintaining appearances rather than investing it or saving it. The restitution will probably take years to complete. The plea agreement represented the best possible outcome given the circumstances, but it also meant Victoria would be financially obligated to her victims for the foreseeable future. Any legitimate income she managed to earn would be garnished to repay the women she'd defrauded, making it nearly impossible for her to rebuild a comfortable lifestyle. What are her plans now? I asked, curious about how Victoria intended to rebuild her life under these constraints. She's talking about moving to Orlando and finding work with a commercial design firm, my father replied. Somewhere she can start over without the baggage of what happened here. The idea of Victoria relocating to rebuild her career in a new city echoed my own decision to leave Miami 8 years earlier, but the circumstances were completely different. While I'd left to escape family drama and build something positive, Victoria was fleeing the consequences of criminal behavior and would carry those consequences with her regardless of geography. The conversation with my father also revealed his own plans for managing the family's reputation in the aftermath of Victoria's scandal. He was considering establishing a victim compensation fund that would supplement the restitution Victoria was required to pay, ensuring that the elderly women she'd defrauded would be made whole more quickly than the legal system would accomplish. It's not our legal obligation, he explained, but these women trusted Victoria because of our family name. I feel some moral responsibility to help repair the damage she caused to people who should have been able to trust a member of our family. His decision to voluntarily compensate Victoria's victims demonstrated the integrity that had shaped my own moral development and explained why Victoria's behavior had been so shocking to everyone who knew our family. The contrast between my father's response to scandal and Victoria's pattern of self-serving choices highlighted exactly why our life trajectories had diverged so dramatically. As spring turned to summer, the immediate crisis of Victoria's arrest faded into background awareness while I focused on the museum project, the foundation's growing success, and plans for expanding Meridian Contemporary into international markets. The scandal had been painful and embarrassing, but it hadn't fundamentally affected my work or relationships in Los Angeles. More importantly, Victoria's criminal behavior had provided final confirmation that my decision to maintain distance from her had been wise rather than vindictive. Someone capable of defrauding grieving widows was not someone whose presence in my life would have been beneficial, regardless of family relationships or social expectations about forgiveness. The woman who'd stolen my fiancé had revealed herself to be someone whose moral deterioration extended far beyond romantic betrayal into genuine criminality. While I felt sorry for the victims she'd harmed and embarrassed by the damage to our family's reputation, I also felt vindicated in my assessment of her character, and grateful that I'd built a life independent of her influence. Victoria's downfall had been swift and comprehensive, but it had been entirely self-inflicted through choices that prioritized short-term advantage over long-term consequences. The contrast with my own trajectory, built through patient work and ethical decision-making, couldn't have been more stark or more satisfying. The greatest revenge, I'd learned, truly was success achieved through integrity and sustained effort. While Victoria faced the consequences of her criminal choices, I continued building institutions that would support artists and enrich communities for decades. That difference in legacy represented the ultimate vindication of the path I'd chosen after her betrayal 8 years earlier. 5 years passed before I saw Victoria again. The encounter happened at the most unexpected moment, during what should have been one of the happiest days of my professional life. Alexander and I were attending the opening of the Whitney Museum's major exhibition, featuring contemporary Latin American artists, an event that represented the culmination of years of relationship building and curatorial vision. The exhibition, titled Emerging Voices: New Narratives from Latin America, featured work by 15 artists whose careers I'd helped develop through Meridian Contemporary and the Foundation. Seeing their pieces displayed in one of America's most prestigious museums, surrounded by collectors, critics, and curators who were discovering their work for the first time, provided satisfaction that surpassed any personal achievement I'd experienced. Isabella Rodriguez had delivered remarks crediting my gallery and foundation with identifying and supporting the featured artists during crucial early stages of their careers. The recognition from such a respected institution validated everything I'd built since leaving Miami, confirming that my curatorial instincts and commitment to emerging talent had contributed meaningfully to contemporary art discourse. Alexander stood beside me as we moved through the galleries, his pride evident in how he described my work to collectors and museum board members who approached us throughout the evening. Our relationship had deepened during the years of building the foundation together, and we'd recently finalized adoption proceedings for a daughter from Colombia, whose birth mother was an artist I'd supported through foundation grants. "You've created something that will influence art history," Alexander said quietly as we stood before a massive installation by one of the youngest artists in the exhibition. "These careers you've launched will shape how people understand contemporary Latin American culture for decades." His words carried the weight of genuine understanding rather than superficial compliment. Alexander had witnessed firsthand the years of studio visits, grant applications, and exhibition planning that had brought these artists to international attention. He understood the significance of this moment not just for my career but for the artistic community I'd helped nurture. The evening reached its peak during the VIP reception, when Maria Santos, one of the featured artists, delivered impromptu remarks about how foundation support had enabled her to develop the body of work now displayed at the Whitney. Her words brought tears to my eyes as she described the difference between creating art in isolation and having institutional backing that provided both financial resources and curatorial guidance. "Camille Torres saw something in my work when I was still a graduate student painting in my apartment," Maria said to the gathered crowd. "She didn't just buy pieces or offer exhibition space. She helped me understand how to develop a sustainable practice that could support my vision long-term." The spontaneous applause that followed her remarks felt like recognition not just of my individual efforts, but of an approach to supporting artists that prioritized long-term career development over short-term commercial success. Every foundation grant, every exhibition opportunity, every introduction to collectors had been calculated to build sustainable careers rather than generate immediate profits. As the evening wound down, I was discussing potential acquisitions with a collector from Houston when I noticed a familiar figure across the gallery. Victoria stood near the entrance, dressed in simple black clothing that suggested either mourning or financial constraint. She looked older than her 36 years, with the kind of weariness that comes from sustained stress and disappointed expectations. Our eyes met across the crowded gallery, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then Victoria began walking toward me with the determined gait of someone who'd been building courage for this encounter. I excused myself from the conversation with the collector and met her halfway, maintaining the composure that had become second nature during years of navigating professional challenges. "Camilla," she said simply, extending her hand in formal greeting. "Congratulations on the exhibition. I read about it in the Times. Thank you, I replied, accepting her handshake while studying her face for signs of the manipulation that had characterized our previous interactions. Instead, I saw something I'd never witnessed before: genuine humility. I wanted to apologize, Victoria continued, her voice barely audible above the gallery's ambient conversation. Not just for what happened with David, but for everything since then. The museum situation, the embarrassment I caused our family, the way I've handled my life. The apology caught me off guard in its directness and apparent sincerity. For years I'd imagined various scenarios for potential reconciliation, but they'd all involved Victoria making excuses or attempting to minimize her actions. This straightforward acknowledgement of wrongdoing was something I hadn't anticipated. I don't expect forgiveness, she added quickly, as if reading my thoughts. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I destroyed, and I'm genuinely sorry for the pain I caused. We stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the celebration of artistic achievement and cultural contribution that represented everything I'd built since leaving Miami. The contrast between this moment of professional triumph and our last conversation at the museum couldn't have been more pronounced. What are you doing now? I asked, curious about how Victoria had ended up at a Whitney opening in New York. I work for a nonprofit in Orlando that helps elderly people who've been victims of financial fraud, she replied with a self-deprecating smile. Turns out my experience as both perpetrator and someone who understands how these schemes work makes me useful in helping victims recover. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Victoria was now dedicating her professional life to helping people like the women she'd defrauded, using her understanding of manipulation and financial exploitation to protect other vulnerable individuals. The pay is terrible and the work is depressing, she continued, but it feels like the first meaningful thing I've done in years. Maybe the first meaningful thing I've ever done. I found myself studying this woman who bore my sister's face, but seemed fundamentally different from the person who'd stolen my fiancé and attempted to manipulate our mother's legacy. The desperation and entitlement that had characterized Victoria's previous behavior had been replaced by something resembling genuine humility and purpose. Are you happy? I asked, the question emerging from curiosity rather than malice. Victoria considered the question carefully before responding. I'm useful, she said finally. That's probably the best I can do given the choices I've made. But seeing what you've accomplished, the artists you've supported, the institutions you've built, I understand what integrity looks like now. Alexander appeared at my side, having noticed our conversation and correctly identified Victoria despite having never met her before. His presence reminded me of everything I'd gained since leaving Miami: a partnership based on mutual respect, professional achievements that enriched communities beyond my immediate interests, and a sense of purpose that didn't depend on external validation. This is my sister Victoria, I said, introducing them with careful neutrality. Alexander extended his hand graciously, demonstrating the diplomatic skills that had made him successful in both business and personal relationships. I've heard a great deal about you, he said without irony or judgment. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Victoria asking thoughtful questions about the exhibition and the foundation's work. Her interest seemed genuine rather than calculating, suggesting that her transformation might be authentic rather than another manipulation strategy. As the gallery began emptying and staff prepared to close for the evening, Victoria prepared to leave. I should go, she said, then added unexpectedly, I'm proud of what you've built, Camilla. You became everything I always pretended to be. The admission was perhaps the most honest thing Victoria had ever said to me. Throughout our youth, she'd presented herself as the more sophisticated sister, while undermining my achievements and ambitions. Now she was acknowledging that I'd developed the substance she'd always lacked. Thank you for saying that, I replied, meaning it. And I hope your work with fraud victims continues to be meaningful. We parted with a brief embrace that felt like closing a chapter rather than opening a new one. I didn't expect to see Victoria again, nor did I want to rebuild a relationship that had caused so much pain. But I felt grateful for the encounter because it provided confirmation that my choices had been correct, and my instincts about character had been accurate. Walking out of the Whitney with Alexander, surrounded by the energy of artistic achievement and cultural contribution, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Victoria's betrayal 8 years earlier had forced me to discover capabilities I'd never explored, while living within the comfortable constraints of family expectations and romantic dependency. The woman who'd cried on her bathroom floor the night of her broken engagement was gone, replaced by someone who understood that genuine success comes from building something meaningful that enriches the world beyond your immediate interests. Victoria's final acknowledgement of this transformation provided closure I hadn't realized I needed. "How do you feel?" Alexander asked as we walked toward the subway, his arm around my waist in the casual intimacy that characterized our partnership. "Complete," I replied, understanding the truth of that word as I spoke it. For the first time in my life, completely satisfied with who I am and what I've built. The greatest revenge, I'd learned, wasn't bringing others down, but rising so high above them that their previous actions became irrelevant to your happiness. Victoria had stolen my billionaire fiancé, but in doing so she'd freed me to become someone far more accomplished and fulfilled than I could have been as David Harrison's wife. 8 years after fleeing Miami with a broken heart, I'd returned to my family's city as someone who commanded respect in international cultural circles, who'd built institutions that would influence contemporary art for decades, and who'd found love with someone who valued my ambitions as much as I did. The woman standing in the Whitney that night had transcended the need for family approval, romantic validation, or social recognition. My worth was measured by the artists whose careers I'd launched, the collectors who trusted my curatorial vision, and the communities enriched by the cultural institutions I'd created. That was a legacy Victoria could never steal, diminish, or manipulate. It belonged entirely to me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.